Now I will introduce tonight's speaker. Do you have an ancestor who resided in Virginia during the Revolutionary War and were curious whether he might have served in the war? Have you possibly considered applying to a lineage society, such as the DAR, SAR, or CAR under said ancestor? This presentation tackles what constitutes a patriot during the Revolutionary War with focus on Virginia residents and resources. From muster rolls to the court books, this presentation will cover some known and not so known collections you should consider in your research. It will also include resources for researching patriots of color, as well as research strategies that determine whether the women or elderly men of your family might have also contributed to the patriotic cause. Brendon Burns is a senior genealogist with the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution in Washington, D.C. He has worked professionally in the field since 2013 when he began working with the NSDAR. He's published 13 books since 2017, most focused on his maternal family roots in Grayson County, Virginia, and also some books related to New York and the Revolutionary War. Burns operates a blog, The Ancestral Clark, for some of his own genealogical research and topics. He also operates a side job as the Virginia genealogist, working for clients to investigate inquiries related to Virginia, as well as 18th century research across the American colonies. Join me in welcoming Brendon, and I will stop sharing so you can start.
Let me make sure I got my screen shared here. Okay, you see me now?
Perfect.
Okay, awesome. Good evening, everyone. My name is Brendon Burns, as Paula said. Working with the DAR for 11 years now, and I work as also the Virginia genealogist. Welcome to my talk about Revolutionary War records, focusing on Virginia and wrapping that around the topic of lineage societies that are related towards Revolutionary War. And I'll get started here real quick with just a rundown of what kind of lineage societies, if you are considering anything related to the Revolutionary War, what kind of eligibility you might need for some of these. With the eternal question as well as how do you find out if your ancestor was a patriot? And I'll kind of go over some of the steps leading up that direction as to what you should do before you get to that step of saying, I want to join the DAR or SAR. How do you know if your ancestor was eligible to have served? I'll skip down a little bit, but I'll say that, there are going to be particular groups of people that are going to be less likely to have contributed in any fashion, whether it be patriotic service or whether it be in the military. I'll make sure I cover those grounds. But if you do get to a point where you do find that you have an ancestor that may be eligible, where do you start finding proofs of service? And I'll start with where do you need to look for military records, considerations that you need to have in mind as you're researching. What other ways, if they did not serve in a military fashion, could your ancestor have contributed? Whether it be patriotic service, would it be civil service? And what would those steps have done towards the revolutionary cause? Again, I'll cover those who are less likely, and I'll also cover some special sections regarding people that would certainly require a lot more research altogether, whether it be proving service or as well proving lineage, or any other conflicting areas. And that would be persons of color or enslaved persons, women, and elderly residents. And then to wrap everything up, I'll talk about, once you found service, what's next? How do you prepare towards membership with any of these lineage societies? So to go ahead and carry on off here, just talking about particular lineage societies that are out there. There's three very well known ones when considering. One I work for, obviously, I work for the DAR here in Washington D.C. There's also the male equivalent, the Sons of the American Revolution in Louisville, Kentucky. There's also the Children of the American Revolution, who's also housed in the same office that I'm at in Washington, D.C. But there's also ones, people always confuse this one quite a bit too. There's also the older Sons of the Revolution, the GSSR or SR in Williamsburg. I'll go over some of the differences between it and the SAR real quick. There's also ones like the Society of the Cincinnati and the Daughters of the Cincinnati, which are far more restrictive. I'll briefly cover some of those, but most likely you would probably know if you're going to be eligible for those. It's not really open to everybody. But they also have the Daughters of the American Colonists in Washington, D.C., and then you also have the descendants of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. So for some of these, for the most part, which a lot of these societies require the approval of at least two members, and it's by reaching out to them, expressing an interest in joining in the first place. For most of these, the DAR, the SAR, the CAR, SR, DAC, you reach out to them. You reach out specifically to either a local chapter, or if it's on a more statewide level, you would reach out to that state society and reach out and express your interest. And they would put together your application process. And then through that, while they're getting your application prepared, two of the members at least would approve and they would sign on. That's generally how it goes. Um, but you do have your invite only membership, which is the Society of the Cincinnati and the Daughters of the Cincinnati. And again, those are far more restrictive because it's based, a lot of people know more about the Society of the Cincinnati, for instance, where it's based off of the eldest male posterity of a commissioned officer from the original society. Although there is the what they call the rule of the 1854, which if your ancestor qualifies for rank of service and term of service, but they were not a part of the original society, you can put that you can join as a member of that society through that ancestor, provided though that only one member can join under that society. Okay. The daughters are a little bit more open, though. Anybody, you could have multiple people representing an eligible ancestor, but again, it is by invite only. Um, but some of these other ones, like there's the DAC as well, which is I included in there because it's more pre-Revolutionary War, but it goes up to July 4th, 1776, and it's not necessarily just those for the American cause so much. It is also just for the colonial, representation in general, which means under the British flag. But it does include anybody that served in a legislative body, any kind of civil service, serving in a militia capacity at all, which, again, for the early years of the war leading up to, can include people that were on either side of the conflict. So that's why I did include that in there. So getting to the talk about how do you know if your ancestor was a patriot? Well, first off, you don't want to go right on the assumption finding a name in a book and then saying, I'm going to prove my ancestor to that person and prove that. Because especially, you get to a point where you find a James Johnson or a William Smith, you have a very common name with you've probably got a lot of people and a lot more people than you think that existed at that time with that name. And you really need to be sure you have the right person down. So really the best way to approach this is just going back on your lineage. Once you get to someone that's living about the Revolutionary War era and of age, you want to really find out first off, was that person of age to have served in the war? So you really want to ascertain a date of birth as much as possible, realizing that, we're talking about Virginia. You don't have a lot of vital records in this period. If you're lucky with someone that lived in a parish that has a surviving parish register, you might be able to get a baptism, but you're not going to get that in a lot of areas. But as much as possible, ascertaining the age of your ancestor to really find out if they could have served in any capacity. You do also have to establish whether that person was alive during the war. That's also a big part. They have to have been alive to perform that service. So you do have to at least know when your ancestor died, or at least when you can last find them. As much as possible for the lineage, prove any marriage and familial relationships and associations. Some of that's not necessarily so much as going to be on the paper, so much as, again, if you have a John Smith or a very common name and you need to ascertain relationships around you to kind of help pinpoint any person's, try to prove identity of somebody, especially in an area where you might have multiple men or women of that name and you really need to kind of whittle down options. You really want to try and build up the relationships around you in case you need to try to make a much more detailed analysis. Much more important, and we always do this with the DAR. And a lot of these things, I'm going to speak as a DAR genealogist here, but we always really, really stress the importance of establishing the residence of that ancestor between 1770 and 1790. I'll put it more broadly like that, but specifically, you want 1774 to 1784 because a lot of service is going to be very contingent to where they lived. You are very unlikely going to have someone from Western Virginia serving in the Navy in Eastern Virginia, for instance. And, you really have to be able to explain that in the best circumstances if that is the case. So little discrepancies like that, you really got to watch out for. And again, also really hop on top of any conflicting evidence. Are there any other persons of that name in that locality? If you have an ancestor that's in Amelia County, Virginia, are there 5 men of that name there during that time. Because, as I'll point out later in this presentation, it's not a first come, first served basis. If you don't know your ancestor is one of those five people from that county, it's very hard to say we're going to just give that to him. So, um, kind of get those things down ahead of time. So I just took some sample lineages here just to kind of show these are real lineages. I'll give you a freebie on this one because this is my own ancestor here who is not eligible right now for the DAR. But this is just kind of, a lot of this is built off of Bible records and tombstones. So this is a very complete example of having the lineage prepared before you start getting to that point of saying, okay, I'm going to start finding service. Okay. And obviously in this case, Jonathan Thomas and William Bourne were both eligible to have served. Jonathan Thomas was actually a pensioner. So a lot of these cases, I have a complete reconstruction of everything ahead of time before I get into that point. And luckily for Jonathan's case, he was a pensioner. So that really provided a lot of life details because it's coming from him. But again, we also realize that we're in an area that does not have a lot of vital records. We may not be lucky to have Bible records or even tombstones. So when you need to have the dates reconstructed, you have this case here of John Craighead from Bedford County, Virginia, where you have to provide some estimations and calculations. His date of birth is estimated from an earliest known record of him. His date of death is based off of when his will was probated. So, those things right there, it's still the bare minimum of what you need in order to move forward because, again, he was of age and we know that he survived the war. So, um, and again, just taking on some considerations here as well, like this is a profile from the DAR here for Edmund Cobb. So in this case, again, we have dates that are approximated. And in this case as well, so this guy has two residences, which took a variety of records in order to construct. And the service cooperates with both locations. The militia service is from Albemarle County, and he furnished supplies from Bedford County. So if one of those things was not in there, like if we had him established in Albemarle County, but we tried to give him service for furnishing supplies, we would have a problem because he's not established with residency in Bedford County. So it's making sure that even in the case where you have someone that moved, you want to make sure you document that as much as possible. So once you have your life events established for your ancestor and you are, it looks like we have a go to go on to the next step, then you want to start, corroborating, where the individual residing to what kinds of things you might find. Again, residence is going to be very pivotal here. Militia is always going to corroborate to the county where that ancestor was living. So again, you're not going to find someone in Princess Anne County, Virginia, with service in the militia in Surrey County unless you can prove that ancestor moved to Surrey County in time for that service to have begun. Larger counties are certainly going to have districts. Where you're able to start getting tax lists at a certain time during this period too. You might actually have it where the tax district corresponds with the militia district. And that kind of makes it easier for you if you were able to use a succession of tithe list and tax list to kind of help establish residency. But militia service is always going to cooperate on that county level. Same thing with civil service appointments, patriotic service, you're going to have that cooperate to residents. State line, it's a little bit harder to pinpoint that down, but for the most part, you're going to find recruitment into a company, into a regiment, going to be taking on a little bit of a larger scale area, but usually a kind of a grouping of counties, if not maybe one or two counties. So there are some resources out there to kind of pinpoint that down. Navy service, again, you're not going to find someone really inland that's going to have served into a water area, but it's most part you want to watch for areas that are waterbound for Navy service. So tips on improving residence before you get to that point as well. Land records are always the kind of standard go-to. It is kind of, especially if you're trying to trace a migration pattern as well, it's usually one of the first areas to go to, but not all ancestors own land as well. And that's where you also want to start going down into other areas like seeking tax records. Land tax records are only going to correspond with land deeds overall. So if you don't own land, then you're not going to be using those. But personal property tax list or a tithe list are going to include all persons of a tithable age. Want to look for the ages of those lists. Sometimes they're 16 years and over. Sometimes they're 21 years and over. And sometimes you want to use a preponderance of evidence as well to kind of help build your case. So using court records or petitions that you might find in state collections, surviving vestry and parish registers. In a lot of areas you have um, uh, burned records. So you might have to, again, use a preponderance of evidence to kind of build your case in this. But sometimes these are very helpful. And again, also will and probate records. Serving in certain positions, such as being a witness to a will or appraising an estate, is going to require you living within that vicinity for the most part, and that can kind of help establish not only residency but also even an age for certain things. Um, Reading out that conflicting evidence. If you do notice through a tax list or by other means that you have several men or women of that name, go ahead and do that service of disseminating all those identities beforehand before you start going into diving, about service. Again, if you've got, 5 John Smiths, it's going to probably be a hell of a project, but, even two people at times, father and son. Sometimes you really want to do that extra research to see who's going to have that service and who's not going to. Again, we don't. I can say this on DER's behalf. I know CAR and SAR are going to be the same way. It's not going to be on a first come, first serve basis. At least these days. It may have been different way back in the day. They might have found a name on a book and said that's them, but these days research is a lot different as a lot more people are joining, as research is being digitized a lot more and published and out there, put out there for the public. But be mindful of the age of your ancestor, their economic status. And I say economic status because your wealthier men like Thomas Jefferson, they're less likely going to be enlisting as privates in a militia. They're not really going to be enlisting as a continental soldier. They're probably going to serve in a commission fashion, or they're going to be providing patriotic services and serving in a more legislative fashion. So all those little considerations you want to take in matter there. So if we're at that point, we're going to start talking about military service, or we want to look that route. Where do we start? Pensions are always the easiest thing to look at because it's more or less the declarations are going to provide a life story. Especially when it comes to federal pensions, they had to provide their age. They had to provide details about where they were residing during the war. They had to provide as much as they could about their service. They had to corroborate with names of officers, events that could help at least the War Department validate their service claims. And a lot of that can be a genealogical goldmine. If you are searching, Full 3, which is the military archive online, which is partnered through Ancestry now, but you can also access it through Family Search, is usually the go-to when it comes to Rev War pensions for any of the colonies or the states. But I will also say when it comes to more the Mid-Atlantic and Southern states, there's the revoirapps.org website, which is very helpful because it's transcriptions of the declarations and also maybe other documents that may be found in some of these pensions. And it makes it a little easier to search if you're especially doing a Google search. And you will find on that website as well, towards the bottom of the website, the homepage at least, there's also transcriptions of rostered and compiled rolls and other service documents that may be of help on a more state and county level. And yeah, again, these are the most helpful when it comes to compiling the life stories of your veterans and also proving their services. So some tips for when you're working with pensions to get started off is to watch the number of the pension. Because it's going to be a number, which is usually begun with a letter. The S means that the soldier was the pensioner. All right, and only the soldier was the pensioner. The letter is based off of who was the last pensioned in this case. So if it's an S, it's only the soldier that was ever pensioned. If it's a W, it means the widow was pensioned. But check the full record because the soldier could have also been pensioned as well. So it could be either the soldier and widow or just the widow. The H means the heirs were pensioned. And again, it's the same situation. It could be all the soldier, widow, and heirs were pensioned, or just the heirs, or just the widow and heirs, etc. There's a lot of compounding elements to all of this. And then lastly, there's the R, which means it was rejected. Now, this can also still be where the soldier was pensioned, and then either the widow or the heirs were rejected. Always look for the reason why that pension was rejected, because depending on why it was rejected is going to depend on whether that service is going to be accepted or rejected for the Lineage Society. And I say that because certain pensions were rejected because you didn't prove 6 months of service, which was a requirement. But um, even just having not 6 months of service is still proof of service, and that could be accepted. But quite a few other pensions were turned down because they were fraudulent. They were turned down because they couldn't prove any service at all. The War Department could not corroborate their claims. Those ones we can't accept. So you always want to look for the reasons why they were rejected. There is a very old ledger that's going around from back in the 1850s that does give out a majority of the rejections for under the various acts of the pension acts, and it is available through ancestry. But again, always find out why it was rejected if that is the case. Um, and again, if the widow is pensioned, her declaration will give marriage details and will sometimes give familial information and sometimes including pages from a family Bible because they needed to provide proof of marriage. So sometimes these can be genealogical gold mines. And additionally, if they did receive the pension, there's likely a payment voucher for the final payment after that pensioner was deceased. And if the pensioner was survived by a widow, then the widow signed off. If the pensioner was survived by heirs, the heirs signed off. And that can help prove if you're looking for heirs of whoever was surviving the pensioner, those can be very helpful for you. A few years ago, I know the National Archives is digitizing those. They are, I think, at this time still closed for access, but the ones for Georgia and Delaware have been digitized on Fold 3. Several other states, they have been transcribed and published, although they're not digitized. But I know Virginia's has been published by Allison Truby Pierce, and it's a 2-volume set. Let's see here. This is just an example. This is one of the ones from Georgia because these are the ones that are digitized. But again, this one here is for the heirs of Patient Bryant, the widow of William Bryant. So here it's going to name the surviving heirs of the widow and her deceased husband. So again, if you're looking for heirs, these are always a good case to go to. The best thing to do as well is to look up, there's an index to the payment vouchers on Fold 3 for all the states. It's an index. And if you go through there and you find your ancestor, if there's the index card, if you see an asterisk on the top of the card, that means there's familial information therein, which is always a good sign to look it up further if you can. So for other proofs of service, if you find out your ancestor is not a pensioner or they didn't qualify, then we work to the next steps. So some of the next steps to go through are some of these sources are very old sources. They're in the public domain now. But the first one would be John H. Gwathmey's Historical Register of Virginia Men in the Revolution, Hamilton J. Eckenrode's List of Revolutionary Soldiers of Virginia, which is 2 volumes. I see the one holding up right there. Those are some of the first 2 ones that tried to index some of the records of the Library of Virginia, and I'm going to go through why some of those books are problematic here in a little bit. So there are some restrictions on, I would say, using those ones to begin. Fold 3, as I mentioned, with the military records from the National Archives, that's a good source to go to as well, particularly for state line and continental troops. It's not really going to have a lot of militia service for Virginia's sake, unfortunately. But there's also M246, which is what M881 is built off of. It's the images of the muster rolls and the payrolls all together. They generally cooperate with each other. I generally say go for M881 because you at least have all the index cards for one person combined. And at least in that case, you can scan through multiple cards and get out the details that you need. And I would suggest always going through all of them. If your ancestor has 57 index cards in M881, go through all of them because you want to find out, make sure he didn't desert, he didn't die, etc. Anything that might conflict with some of the events you might be putting together. There's also the Rev War military bounty warrants and preemption warrants, which are found on the Kentucky Secretary of State website. We'll talk about those here after a while about the preemption warrants and what those are. Additional ones here are Louis Burgess's Virginia Soldiers of 1776. It's a 3-volume set. This one contains a lot of different rosters of state line, those who received bounty land. It does also contain abstracts of those who were pensioned by the state, not necessarily just federal pensions, but also state pensions. There's J.T. McAllister's Virginia Militia in the Revolutionary War. It does contain some um, soldiers that did serve in various militia units across the different counties in Virginia, if they are known. A lot of the lists, though, are going to be based off of those from the county orders, which would be more the commissioned officers, the lieutenants, the captains, ensigns, and etc. Marjorie Harding's George Rogers Clark and his men in the military records. This is going to apply for anybody that's going to be out in the frontiers of Kentucky, or what is now Kentucky and Illinois. Back then it was the Kentucky District and Illinois County. If you have anybody that was living out the frontier at that time, this is based off of all of his papers, contains transcripts of militia list. This is a very helpful guide for anybody that would be living out in those areas, because those areas were considered Virginia by government at the time. My colleague and coworker, Bevan J. Creel, has done a lot of work when it comes to Rev War research as well for Virginia. Call him a little expert when it comes to Library of Virginia records as well. He, over the years, has done some transcriptions of some of the records. He's done one for the audited accounts. I think it was volume 18, if I'm not mistaken. And then he's also his second volume of the Selected Virginia Revolutionary War Records series is the transcription of the Augusta County Court Martial minutes. And I'll explain in a minute why that's important when I talk about sources here. Another roll here is called the Chesterfield Size Roll. You might also hear it called the Chesterfield Supplement. There's various publications out there that have transcribed all or parts of it over the years. I have an image of it here shortly, but the southerncampaign.org has a transcription of it. Basically what it is an entire list of all those that recruited after Virginia tried to rebuild its regiments after the fall of Charleston in 1780. It's a very descriptive list of people, and it's very helpful. Elizabeth Bentley, the Virginia Military Records. This is a collection of different articles from the Magazine of Virginia Genealogy periodical. It's, various people over the years that have abstracted different militia lists or anything related to Rev War, or just anything in Virginia history in general. She's called anything that relates to the Revolutionary War into one book. That could be a very helpful resource there. This, by the way, is just an image. This is the transcribed version of the Chesterfield Size Roll. So this is just one page of many, but it gives you a very descriptive look of not only in the bottom half there is the extension of the top half, but you got the names of the soldiers, their age, their height, their trade, their nativity, which can be very helpful, and then also, of course, as we always want to know, where they were residing. If you do go through it, you will also see that there are people that are in here that are not from Virginia. There are people from Maryland. I've seen some from Georgia and New York in here. So these can be very helpful if you have an issue with trying to prove identity with someone, especially if it's a very common name. Now, the guy who did put together this image, by the way, he has also gone through and identified people that were pensioners. And so on the image that you can see where there's little numbers and brackets, some of those people were pensioners at a later date. Going forward again in the list of resources here when it comes to military, the Library of Virginia is continuing to digitize and expand their digital collections. I would definitely say spend some time on there to break down the digital collections they have with the Virginia Memory site in particular is the collection of Rev War bounty warrants for anyone that did receive bounty land. These are digitized. They're TIFF images is what they are. But these are people that received land. Then you have the rejected claims. Those are the people who did not serve a sufficient term of service in order to receive that bounty land. There is a book, by the way, that is published for those rejected claims, but they still do hold value genealogically because sometimes it is for heirs. You do have the state pensions as well, which are also all digitized. Sometimes those who receive state pensions also receive federal pensions, so you might want to corroborate those details too. There's the collection of governor's letters. You have the digitized military resources. A lot of these kind of pertain to also not just military service, but also public claims for public providing the certificates for supplies, furnishing or moving provisions by wagoneering, etc. You have military certificates, proof of pay. There's also the public service claims that I just mentioned, which I'll also again explain that here a little bit more as well, because you can also back that up through Family Search for finding the original certificates, not only for what they provided, but also what the court provided in terms of pay stubs, as well as also just general petitions to the General Assembly that for whatever purposes they may be, whether for depredation, etc. Um, so when it comes to proof of patriotic service or civil service, obviously things are going to expand out a little bit more. So I was just talking about the public claims. So Janice Abercrombie and Richard Slatton have a 3-volume set going through all the counties where you do have um, court order claims, and these are called the Virginia Revolutionary Public Claims. That is not misspelled; it's Publick. But it goes through the county court order books, and these are based off of the list from the final step of the process. These were the claims that were respected and paid out. But you do have the certificates ahead of time as well that were issued by the claimant, and those you could find on Family Search. And to find those, you go to the catalog on the Family Search page, type in Virginia, look through court records, go to public service claim certificates. And if you go to that collection, it's by county. Sometimes the rolls will contain multiple counties in them, but they're in alphabetical order by county. And then if you go to the county, then it's broken down. There, all the images, all the certificates are arranged on each frame in alphabetical order as well. So surnames A through Z. I highly recommend using that collection over Abercrombie and Slatton if you have an ancestor, regardless of whether it's male or female, that died during the war, because you're going to need to know when that claim was filed, and if it's the claimant himself, or if it's the estate. And we don't honor claims given out to the estate because we don't know who paid it. Because we typically try to honor the claimant by name rather than an associated group of people. There's a Virginia Legislative Petitions book by Randolph Church. This goes through a lot of the petitions that may be in the Library of Virginia website already, but in a published form, this is also available as well. Lewis Summers, Annals of Southwest Virginia, has a 3-volume set. A lot of these are culling information from the court order books as well, but they're just focused on Southwest Virginia, specifically Fincastle, Montgomery, Botetourt, Washington counties, Augusta County, etc. I would also look specifically in just to county court order books themselves, whether patriotic or civil service. Now, various places do have these already transcribed and published wherever they do exist, because these are very much subject to whether they exist or not. Virginia, unfortunately, has a lot of missing records due to record loss over years, particularly in Eastern Virginia, and we may not have these records if that is the case. I know my colleague again, Bevan Creel, he's published transcriptions of several counties in Virginia, for instance, Augusta, Bedford, Brunswick, Halifax, Lancaster, Louisa, and Richmond counties. Richmond County, not Richmond City. And those are all very helpful in trying to find out whether there could be any proof of patriotic or civil service, and even at other times too, validating proof of military service too, because sometimes you did have families that were families of a soldier seeking payment or assistance from the county because their soldier was away for a period of time and they needed to petition themselves, or they needed to petition for support from the county for food provisions or money. I'm going to keep throwing Bevan out there again as well. If he's watching, I'm sorry, Bevan. But he also has a website called Virginians and the Revolutionary War. It's varevwar.com. He's done a lot of work with Library of Virginia resources over the years. He's been putting a little bit more emphasis in recent years about tracking down loyalists of Virginia, which, that's what we don't want. But if you need to find that information out, he's been putting together a list of deserters and loyalists as he's gone through all these records through all the various collections at the Library of Virginia. But his website also includes those that you would not also typically find in other published resources, because he's using the audited accounts for a lot of his sources. So sometimes that's also a good place to look at. But he does also include lists of soldiers from the state and continental lines and also various county militias. Again, these are largely coming from the audited accounts. And if he's able to ascertain where that soldier is coming from, if it's for service in the Amelia County militia, he'll include that information in there. It's a direct transcription, so it's good to kind of double check with that. And he does provide the sources as well wherever needed. So if you needed to track that record down. He has also compiled a list of what he has found so far from the same accounts for anyone that is African American colored, and also just any non-soldier service as well, patriotic service for being a wagoneer, furnishing supplies, or again families receiving support and so forth. A lot of DAR members already kind of know about this website already. It's from a DAR member, Debbie Dway. She has a website called Researching Your Patriot Ancestor. The website is learnwebskills.com, all one word. Um, Hers really breaks down the steps right down to its essential basic steps about how to document finding your patriot ancestor from starting your lineage from you, essentially working your way all the way back, and some tips for tracing your lineage and getting started, and then finding a Revolutionary War patriot and how to document it, and just some tips and advice on how to do that. She does have a links page on there, which helps link to many useful DAR links and databases, as well as just general genealogical repositories, such as Family Search or Ancestry, for people that they may need that assistance. What databases may be helpful, just for general research, both service and lineage. I will, as a footnote, add, as of recently, though, the website has had some security issues, but not on Firefox. So I would just advise if anybody visits that website and they kind of get an alert on it, sometimes something's going on with it security wise, security certificate. So if you do have Firefox, I would advise using that website for that. But one notable thing about her website is if you go to the page that says Finding a Patriot, scroll down to the subsection called Revolutionary War Service. She has a link for all the types of acceptable service. And if you go to that page, it's broken down into general services and then all the states. And it pretty much covers a lot of the general resources that we at the DAR use, the SAR and CAR. So there's really no kind of surprises there for a lot of things. But she does include links to digitized copies of older service sources, like some of the ones I mentioned, like WAFME and Eckenrode, if they are within the public domain, if they're on Google Books or archives.org. One helpful thing, instead of scrolling through tax lists trying to find her ancestors, she does have an every name index of everybody in the 1783 personal property tax in Virginia, with the exception of Chesterfield, Montgomery, and York counties. For Montgomery, there's no 1783 tax list for that year. But for everywhere else, there's an every name index in there based off of the name that's used in there, the spelling of that name in there. So if you are trying to find somebody wherever in Virginia, that could be actually a useful starting point for residents if you need to. But she does also include links to different types of service, civil service as well. Although it's mostly linking towards court ordered books, but she does have a chart breakdown of where to look if it's microfilmed and where to find those. She does also, again, have links to also digitized copies of like McAllister's Virginia Militia and the Rev War and so forth. These are just some screenshots of her website here as well. So this is the main page, Researching Your Patriot Ancestor. But as I noted here, if you go down to the section below where it says Rev War Service, there's a link here that says click here. There's also that link there at the bottom of that section that says Sources of Rev War Service. If you click on that, you get to this section. And again, it starts off with general, but it goes down through all the states as well: Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, etc. And it has all these different links. Some of them may be through ancestry.com, some through Fold3, some through digitized books that may be on Google Books or archive.org. There's some that are not within public domain. They have copyright restrictions that you may have to do a image request that she has access to. You can just contact her for that. She has all the instructions on there. And then here's the image right there. As you can see, there's the every name index to the 1783 supply tax, the personal property tax. And again, this is a very helpful index in general if you're just trying to find where your ancestor may be. So I mentioned some exceptions earlier, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight this with the Bevan Friel's book on the Augusta County Court Martial Minutes. Gwathmey cited the court martial minute books for anybody that is claimed to have Augusta County militia service. Well, if you're in the court martial minute books, it's most likely because you didn't show up to muster, which means you're being court martialed to pay your fine or plead your case. So that's not a good proof of service. So if your ancestor is in Augusta County, Virginia, and you're looking for militia service, you don't want to use Gwathmey. You will most likely want to look at Bevan's book and try to find why he's appearing at a court martial, whether he's defending his case, whether he got fined, or whether he was exonerated. You do want to try and find out for that. As is the case with any with the DAR, the SAR, the CAR, if you do find that someone had a negative, negative service record, such as deserted or defected to the other side, unfortunately, that negates the whole prior service record, and you're going to want to find proof of service after that date of that event. So in this case, if your ancestor was court-martialed in 1781, you're going to want to find service after that date if you're trying to establish that ancestor. Gwathmey is going to otherwise be best for proving militia service anywhere else in Virginia. I would say if it comes to state troops or continental service, you're going to want to look at fold 3. And I say that too because there's times too where he might have multiple records from different locations for the same person indexed multiple times, and some people might read that as being multiple people of the same name. So you might want to best corroborate that with better resources. So another thing as well, is your ancestor in the state line or continental troops, or would they be in the militia? Well, one thing to take into consideration is that anybody that was in the state line or continental line, they were entitled to bounty lands and pensions. So you always want to seek that paper trail, especially if they're in the second half of the war. They were certainly entitled to it. So follow that proof of whether they claimed their bounty land, or if they ever got a state pension, a half pay pension, or a federal pension. The half pay pensions are also on fold 3. E.M. Sanchez Saavedra has an excellent guide. It's the Guide to Virginia Military Organizations in American Revolution, 1774 to 1787. This is a whole breakdown of all the Virginia regiments, when they were organized, the history of each regiment, what action they saw. It does cover some the known Navy ships as well, any Navy and Marine service, and also some militia service as well, if it was organized and called for by the state. The reason the book can be helpful, though, is particularly when it comes to the state line regiments, there is some information regarding the changes and organizations of each regiment when officers were discharged, when they died, killed, etc., but also some information about where enlistment may have taken place at. So, and some of that might be on a company level within each regiment. It'll say this company was probably probably recruited from Hampshire County, Virginia, and another one from Loudoun County, Virginia, which will really help you nail down if you have the right guy, if you find a person of that name and that company. Those would be some details that are very helpful to know. But if you don't have those details otherwise, and you're trying to figure out whether your ancestor is that Richard Smith in Captain Johnson's company, the best thing to do is to kind of look up, if you can find some other soldiers that may have been pensioned or received bounty land and served under the same captain, to see if you can try to ascertain some of their details that might corroborate with your ancestor to kind of help build your case, or whether it works against your case. So how easy is it to prove militia service in Virginia? Well, unlike other states, particularly up to the north, it's not that easy in Virginia. Certain counties do benefit from having surviving lists that exist in state collections or various archives, but for the most part, if you are able to prove anything, you might only find proofs of pay and not active service. Um, Other areas as well, Culpeper County, Montgomery County, Botetourt County are going to have class lists, which are more a list of the persons that are of an age and eligible to have served, but it's not actually proof of active service or that they mustered. But we do treat that as a proof of service just because. In a lot of cases, it is otherwise difficult to prove. Um, for other militia service, most likely this is going to benefit most people that were commissioned, but look at the county order books for the officers, the appointments, but also in those cases as well where you might have had a family petition because they needed the assistance. They'll say that their family member or so and so is serving in the army or the militia. It'll also say too is sometimes if the soldier died in service, that can also help you with your case as well. Um, Again, otherwise, you're going to be seeking for the proof of pay, which would be the audited accounts. These are kept in the Library of Virginia. Some of these, again, as I mentioned, my colleague Bevan Creel, he's transcribed and published these. Others are not available except through the original volumes, or they're available through microfilm through the Library of Virginia. Some areas where you can also look as well. Um, Magazine of Virginia Genealogy, which you can, if you become a member of the Virginia Genealogical Society, you can get copies of. It's part of their membership process. But over the years, you'll have people that have gone to the Library of Virginia or this wherever they'll go, and these people will provide transcriptions of records they come across. You never know what kinds of things people might come across that might be relevant to Rev research on there, and it's always beneficial to help. If you are a member of the Virginia Genealogical Society, their website for members only does have the ability for you to search these records that have been digitized. Federal pension records. Do note that the first few pension acts did not accept militia service. Um, if their pension was rejected for the fact the service was not pensionable based on whatever act they applied through, or because they could not prove at least 6 months of service, that pension is still usable. But again, if it wasn't accepted because it's militia service, it could still be accepted. And again, look for those class lists for those counties where that is where those are a thing, mostly in the western counties. One note when it comes to militia, state line, continental service is age. So this is from the some of the acts that were passed throughout Virginia during the war. So to start, when the war began, all free males, hired servants, and apprentices between the ages 16 and 50 were required to roll in the county militia unless they were exempted, and the court would have to personally exempt them on that. In 1777, all men aged 18 to 50 years, they were to enroll in their local militia. If they were single and had no children, they were subject to being drafted in the Continental line. And those men were encouraged to volunteer or provide a substitute as opposed to being drafted. By 1782, that Continental line requirement had been amended for all able-bodied men who were at least 5'4" in height and between the ages of 18 and 50 years. Now, you do have various requirements when it came to Quakers and Mennonites, all which were pacifist groups, which otherwise would have tried to get out of their service. But county order books would basically delineate those eligibility statuses right there. So, what is patriotic service? If we're not looking for military service, what other ways could they have served? So, patriotic service is one way. So this is a wide variety of services, such as serving as a delegate to state legislatures or serving on a committee, such as the Committee of Safety. Some of these can be very early in the war, some a little bit later, or any committee geared towards providing necessities for the war, ammunition, etc. Furnishing supplies. Again, some of the resources I already covered, the public court claims, those can be very helpful on that. You have what's called a supply tax, which is payment of a approved tax, which was geared towards raising money for reimbursing war efforts. For Virginia's sake, only the 1783 is generally accepted, the personal property tax. But there were select other taxes that do exist in fragments in certain counties, such as a tax in Henry County in 1780, or there's another one that's the Continental tax in Westmoreland County in 1780 that do also qualify. Most of the other tax lists from the war era that did raise those supplies, the exact list are unlocated or they're missing. So you're really not going to find a whole lot outside of 1783 for the most part. There's what's called suffering depredation, which is anybody furnishing claims for having their estate stolen or destroyed by the army. These are going to be particularly geared towards areas along the eastern areas, along the James River, where you saw Cornwallis and his army march up and down. Um, You'll have a claim for any slaves that were taken, property damaged, and so forth. If you had prisoners of war, if you took an oath of allegiance to the state or not the king, those all count as patriotic service. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but you have what's called a preemption and settlement warrant. This is basically under the Acts of May and October 1779. Um, the legislation allowed settlers to make legal claims on unpatented lands in the western counties of Virginia. And it was broken down into four districts where this could happen. The first district, which was Monongalia, Yohogania, and Ohio counties. You had the second district, which was Augusta, Botetourt, and Greenbrier counties. You had Washington and Montgomery counties in the third district. And then the whole fourth district was what was then called Kentucky County, which in 1780 became the Kentucky District and became Fayette, Jefferson, and Lincoln counties. But what the law required was each settler who had settled on the land prior to Jan 1, 1778 and resided there for at least a year or raised a crop of corn was allowed a maximum of 400 acres under the settlement right and an additional 1,000 acres max adjoining their settlement under the preemption right. Now, if they settled after Jan 1, 78, they were allowed to claim a max of 400 acres under the preemption right. But it's important for service purposes because in October 1779, and that's the date you need to look for, the law was amended requiring that no land was to be given as a preemption right unless that person took an oath of allegiance to the Commonwealth. Now, note that if you do have any experience working with preemption and settlement warrants, they did issue these to women as well. But the legislation did not require women to take the oath of allegiance, and therefore it's not service if you find a female ancestor that received one of these warrants, just as a heads up. But they were otherwise issued at the same time as the Land Office Treasury land warrants, though it should also be noted that we have not been able to find any legislation establishing any oath required on that part, so the Treasury land warrants do not count. But for the preemption and settlement warrants, again, these are going to be all for the frontier counties of Virginia at that time. A lot of these are going to be in the Kentucky Secretary of State's website. If you look up settlement preemptions, they are digitized on there. There's also the Kentucky Historical Society's publication, the certificate book of the Virginia Land Commission. For those in the Monongalia area, that whole area that was fought over jurisdiction between Pennsylvania and Virginia, you can check out what's Earl Core's The Monongalia Story, the volume one, which is the prelude from pages 156 to 332, has a lot of transcriptions of those who received preemptions. Most of those do qualify under the Act. And then the original preemption certificates from the Virginia Land Office are at the Library of Virginia. The first 2,100 certificates of those are microfilmed in the microfilm room if you go to the Library of Virginia. And a brief rundown if it comes to civil service as well. So civil service is going to be any county appointed position requiring taking an oath upon assuming office. And the implication of this service is that the oath is applied towards the protection of the new state government after the overthrowing of Lord Dunmore in 1775. So overall, any kind of service that was appointed through a county court would qualify under this. So this can include being a sheriff or an undersheriff, a road surveyor, and those who were repairing the roads, constables or tax collectors, as well as also jurors, because they had to take an oath as well. So, who would be less likely to have military service overall when it comes to the war? Well, you have your pacifist groups that existed in Virginia at the time. Quakers are obviously the most infamous of those. They actively persuaded their members not to take sides during the war or take up any arms. Their stances were particularly anti-war. Those who did show support faced being disowned. The monthly meeting minutes are generally detailed when it comes to those instances, so I would always check for that to make sure. But you also had instances where even in-house committees also provided they also showed those who paid muster fines that faced punishment simply because they paid the fine to get out of punishment from the state government. So you had a lot of both sides of people being attacked on this, but Quakers actively were anti-war. Baptist as well. Unlike Quakers, Virginia did not allow or recognize Baptists to affirm an oath. I know this as well because I have some ancestors of mine from Bedford County that tried actively to petition the government multiple times to try and affirm an oath rather than swear an oath, and they did not allow it or recognize it. So you had those that because they didn't accept their petitions or allow an affirmation, they faced heavier taxing and penalties for failing to attend their muster. Um, your Swiss, German, Anabaptist groups as well. You don't have many of those in Virginia at this time, but your Mennonites and Dunkards, they're more in concentrated areas in the Shenandoah Valley, but a lot of those areas are also not really going to be facing or providing any military service whatsoever. This is just an instance right here from the Cedar Creek monthly meeting minutes in just outside of Richmond, Virginia. And this is on ancestry, but you had someone here that was simply questioned just because he hired a man to go into the army for his place, and his membership was being questioned. So any little act like that for Revolutionary War service is probably a good thing, but in terms of his faith is a bad thing. So always look for those monthly meeting minutes if you need any further information about that, because if it is found that your ancestor is an active Quaker, you are going to have to prove, which side did they go for? Did they go with the patriotic cause, or did they stay with their faith? You really have to watch out for loyalists in Virginia as well, because you did have areas that were very loyalist heavy, particularly from my home area of Norfolk, Virginia. The mercantile population was known to be very loyalist heavy. That's how the Norfolk Naval Yard got started. It was confiscated and converted over for a patriotic purpose, but you had many loyalist families on the eastern shore of Virginia. You had a very strong loyalist population in central Virginia, particularly Bedford County. I would also strongly watch out for anybody that has a ancestor in that area to watch for those court order books and make sure that they weren't fined for any reason there, because you had a lot of people that were identified as inimical to the cause there. And then you had very strong loyalist sentiments in southwestern Virginia. A lot of conspiracy theories going on down there during in Montgomery County during the war, so really got to watch out. Um, Especially this is an area where government jurisdiction was very thin and more spread out, so you're more likely to have a loyalist ancestor in those areas than you are a patriot. So really watch out for any kind of list that you see there. Really pay attention to those court order books where they do survive for any charges of persons being inimical to the cause. Often is the case, the court would charge somebody, that person would have to appear in court and plead their case, and the court would either charge them or they would exonerate them. And always look for that exoneration, because upon that they would take an oath. So let's talk about some of the specialty groups here. So I'm going to start with talking about women and any female service that you might have. So obviously it's going to be much difficult to prove a woman as an ancestor, as a patriot, because women cannot own property unless they were legally declared femme coverts or unless they were widows. The femme covert status is going to be issued by court, so it's not anything that all women are going to have at that time. It's really going to be in certain situations, particularly for those who were given stewardship of their own estate through inheritance. Otherwise, any property is going to be assumed to have belonged to her husband if she's a married woman during the war, unless, again, there's that legal agreement which allows her ownership of her own property. But common examples of where you're going to find women providing assistance to the war effort is largely through providing supplies to the war in the courts wherever they resided. You'll see claims for someone providing beef or bacon, but these are largely going to be made from widows, as you will find. This is also the case when it comes to paying supply taxes. Again, it's largely going to be for widows. You're very, very rarely going to find any single women providing any support in that case, if any at all. Wealthier women and women of status are likely going to have a little bit more ability to act a little bit independent of their spouses, though, in certain situations. And I say that as there's the Ladies Association that began about 1779, 1780, specifically for the purpose of providing provisions for the Army. Martha Washington and Martha Jefferson were among those that led those efforts, but knowing those names already, they had that power and that influence already to able to do that and network with other women from other states to do that. So it's not going to be, any woman that's going to be able to do that. But there are some examples where you are able to find some women like that in that status. You might be able to find situations as well out in the frontier of women assisting in efforts of guarding forts. Um, Largely, you're going to find these through interviews through the Draper collection, and I would really stress looking at that and not a story told from a son or a grandson, because largely it's going to be about, is that person providing that interview, were they present at that event, and are they providing an actual eyewitness account from what they recollect? That's going to be the acceptance of that evidence. And again, there's also situations as well, again, mostly through widows, but women who suffer depredations as a result of war. Um, this could be as a result of either the American Army or the British Army, because the American Army also pillaged the states in order to help themselves. So it's not necessarily just the British side, but the claim must be naming the women directly. Sometimes you can also find these claims as well through widows' pensions as well. They might say that, so and so, did this during the war. That can be acceptable at times as well. But again, as I mentioned earlier as well, these claims cannot be to an estate. It can't be the estate of Richard Johnson, deceased, because again, we don't know in that case who was the claimant who provided that service and so forth. Another thing as well, and this is on a more very specific level as well. I'd say, if you're really stretching for proof of female service, this is where you would go as well. But seeking the audited accounts and various day books, looking through particular archival manuscripts. Like for instance, I have this one here of a day book from the Williamsburg Public Store in August 1779, um, which is also held the it's also held on microfilm at the John D. Rockefeller Library in Williamsburg. It's a collection of at least 54 women who were paid for making shirts for the army in that year. Um, but as you can see here, you have this list here. It also contains men, but you'll have a name, but you may not always have a status or residence. So sometimes you're really striving for details on trying to figure out where these women might be from, but sometimes this may be the only time you're able to find anything as well. Like for instance, the first name up there above there is Miss Mary Buck. So that you're already giving a marital status right there just off of her title alone. Your elderly residents are very unlikely to take up arms in a militia or regiment that required marching. You might hear stories about an ancestor that, had a skirmish, fought off a skirmish on his own property, but that kind of, especially if it's told through a descendant, it's not going to be acceptable basis of evidence. But if you have a 60 or 70-year-old ancestor, they're very, very unlikely going to be serving in their local militia because they were beyond the age. And if they were required marching, all states had to order against anybody over a particular age marching in general. But they are more likely to contribute through the patriotic cause, through supply taxes, taking an oath, or furnishing supplies. So if your ancestor is over a certain age, I would strongly lean that direction as opposed to trying to prove military service. And note that oral tales and stories are not evidence. The record must be contemporary to the time of an event. And if it's from an interview, it must be from someone who witnessed or experienced that event. So again, a retelling from a descendant is not going to qualify. And then we get down to an even difficult task of enslaved persons, free blacks. Um, Enslaved persons did not often take part in the war, but if they did, it was for the British cause because the British actively recruited people to join them with the promise of freedom if they did enlist. But you do have noteworthy examples of enslaved persons that did serve on the patriotic side. Um, they are also known to have been hired out by masters, but it is harder to prove those. I would say um, definitely strive for those audited accounts if you're seeking that proof. Because generally, if you did have someone that was of an enslaved status, they are going to be mentioned with their master. That pay is going to go to the master for that service as well. You did have free blacks that did serve in the war. There's actually quite a few of them that lived long enough to receive state pensions and lived as late as 1818 to receive their federal pensions as well. And those are often going to be the best resources for proving their service record overall, as well as their life story. Um, Especially in recent years, there's a lot of databases and archives out there right now that are actively working on dedicating time and resources with a lot of volunteers to help digitize and index record collections, really highlighting anything that's telling the African American story. Virginia is definitely one of those, especially when it comes to the Library of Virginia. their project, the Virginia Untold, the African American narrative page. That is definitely one to check out for. And I include here on this page here, it's on their page, it's a link for related resources, and it goes through a whole gamut of different kinds of resources. And it may not necessarily be related towards the Revolutionary War. A lot of these may be more based towards assistance with lineage, which often more often is the case, is the real feat, is trying to prove that far back. But always check out the Chancery Records Index if you're not familiar. That's an excellent project they've been undertaking with digitizing all the loose papers for all the counties that have them. You have specific ones like Dinwiddie County or Fairfax County. It's basically providing lists through all their records of index list of people that are known to have been enslaved or free blacks. Loudoun County. And also another one that's also we've also used a lot with the DAR is Paul Hynek's Free African Americans in Colonial Virginia page. It's freeafricanamericans.com. Very well done research on his. It's broken down by family. I will say, having done some free black research as well, not every family is represented in there or thoroughly, but for ones that are especially well-known cases, everything is well cited and does present very well-known cases of trying to prove lineage and descent as well from someone. Um, what we do have as well, and I'll speak on the DAR's behalf on this one as well, because I am a member of the Minority Lineage Committee here, but we do have what's called the Patriots of Color database. If you go to the website for the, and scroll over to the section, the tab that says Rev War, and there's a tab on the side for Patriots of Color. And this is based off of a number of years of research that's been taken over this since the 1980s. It initially began with a publication called The Forgotten Patriots, which had been called upon from various smaller publications for each of the original states, highlighting minority patriots. And then overall, in 2008, an 874-page guide to all of these patriots, this index, as you will, of not only African Americans but also Native Americans, or anybody that was simply identified as colored. It was compiled in this case. Since 2011, we have this book available for free as a PDF. If you go to the website, you are able to download this. But since 2020, the DR now has what's called the E Pluribus Unum Educational Initiative. It's increasing awareness of underrepresented Rev War patriots, including African Americans and Native Americans, as well as female patriots. So sometimes it's all three of those, including even white female patriots as well, increasing the awareness of their stories in these situations to help make people aware of their stories as more information is coming around. And this database that we do now have, the Patriots of Color, it continues to grow as we continue to have more things digitized and added to our collection. So if you go to the website, the database, so in this case, I've collected search by surname. So you have all the letters right there that you can go through. If you click on one, in this case, I've clicked it on N, then it clicks the additional search criteria, which is the first three letters of the name that you're going to search for. So you have all these variations starting with the surname N. And then I clicked on NIC. So you have all these results here. And it's not just Virginia specific, it can be for any of the states as well. As you can see here in these search results, we have Massachusetts, Maine, and Virginia. But it provides what available information we have at the time based off of, we might have found a certain search result over time that pertains to this. Certain people have more descriptions than others. Sometimes it might just be merely a mention of a name in a record. In this case, I've chosen Amos Nickens, who is a pensioner, and we do also have established in our database as a free black or classified as an other free based off of the 1810 census. But if you go to these profiles as well, all the records are referenced on there as well. And if they are able to be accessed through another database or through the DAR collections, there's a link at the bottom there with the reference descriptions to where you can find out the images or further information. If it is something where you might need to get an additional image, that's through the DAR library. They have the instructions on there about how to order a copy of that. And there's also what's called the Patriot Records Project, the index. We, for many years, had a large collection of microfilm. We had our our wing at the DAR library called Symes, where people could access all that microfilm. But over the years, since everything is digitized, we now have digitized all those collections, and we have that available now through our website. It's called the Patriot Record Projects Index. And that's where we've had DAR volunteers going through and individually indexing every image so that you can search for it in this index. And it's a lot of stuff. Some of this stuff may already be on Family Search, but some of these other ones are coming from state archives and libraries, such as the New York Archives and the Library of Virginia. I will add that although we do have a lot of the New York Archive stuff right now, it's not thoroughly indexed. So I'll throw that out there, but we do have it. But it's a searchable name index and also through more specific record collections overall. And it does contain a list of specific collections if you search on there, which have been indexed that you are able to view. You are able to view the images of these results, but printing is not allowed for the general public. But if you need to, there is a request form on how to order a copy of an image. And you can use this also to search for minority patriots and female patriots as well. It's not restrictive to just any one type of patriot. Um, Only the surname or part of a surname is required to search. If you are searching for a Native American or a free Black or enslaved person without a surname, their first name or their call name is going to be the name that you search as well. But those with an identifiable or clear residence or any other identifying factors may also be included in the search results as well. So there's some other things that can help you assist your research. But here's the just a screenshot of that right there. The home page for the Patriot Records Index. And then just a search, what the search results look if you type in Nathan Thomas, all the different collections that you have there on the side. You have a couple instances where you have the county where they are. And then for the one there for the Louisa County, here's the page for that right there that you can view if you needed to look to that additionally. So putting everything together as we get to the end of this presentation here, you want to put everything on your lineage and documentation together. You want to make sure you have the copies of all your documentation to prove every life event in the lineage, not just your patriot, but throughout the lineage, what proves their birth, what proves their death, relationships, etc. If you do not have exact dates, you can provide estimates of dates as long as the evidence is provided to support them, and also as long as your calculations are grounded within reasonable or more common accepted methods, such as being 21 years of age to do something. Marriage dates are not required, but if a marriage date cannot be found and a relationship must be inferred, the relationship must be proven to both parties. This, especially in Virginia's case and a lot of southern states, can be very difficult on proving the relationship to the mother. So it's always stringent. If you cannot prove that, don't put the mother on the page. You really want to make sure you have that relationship proven. It's not always going to be assumed that one person married one time, especially if you don't have the proof. You never know if there may be another marriage missing in that case. And if you don't know, use XX as a placeholder in the lineage. Don't forget, you must always provide the proof of relationship in the between each generation of your lineage. You want to make sure you have all those proofs. Don't assume, and use resources that are acceptable. I'll say, for instance, like relationships that are drawn through Find a Grave are not acceptable because it's user generated information. But you want to use vital records, and if you're beyond that era, then use census records, land records, court records, wills, etc. And definitely always address any discrepancies in your information or your research ahead of time, such as if you have a death certificate naming the father as John Smith when we otherwise know his name to be William Smith. Put out a sheet of paper and address that discrepancy. But you have all this other evidence that says this. You have the 1870 census, you have the 1880 census, so forth. You want to address that discrepancy ahead of time so that you don't risk that correspondence from the society saying, oh, "What's this say?" So little things like that you want to be wary of ahead of time. Address all other conflicts as well beyond the era of vital records. Has the identity be properly ascertained? And I say this, if you have a John Miller or a John Smith, do you have the correct John Smith? You want to make sure, if there's migrations happening, do you have you properly traced that migration all the way down? Or is there any reasonable doubts that we might have a problem proving that identity? If you definitely have someone that married multiple times, definitely follow those, especially tracing through the women's ancestry, proving those name changes. You want to make sure that we are proving the correct person each time. provide brief explanations when necessary. If a date or place is not directly inferred or stated on your record, such as if you're trying to calculate an age based off of something, provide just a quick something saying, this is based off of, his age of, being born in 1745 is estimated from being, on a land record on this date. But make sure those computations are based on fact. And when they're not grounded upon universal or generally accepted rules, make sure that you are supporting your facts with other evidence to support your claim. Make sure that the proof of the relationship in your lineage is direct evidence. And by that, I mean direct evidence being a vital record, like a birth record naming parents, or a marriage register, marriage record naming parents, or a will or a probate record, so and so naming so and so as an heir. Court records declaring heirs of a decedent or multiple parties, deeds, church records, etc., proving A is the parent or child of B, so forth. That is direct evidence. But if you do not have direct evidence, or you cannot find anything through a diligent search, then you're going to need an analysis to prove and summarize that relationship. You will need to demonstrate your research. Always check though, because most societies have a limit on how many analyses that you can provide on any one lineage. So if you need to explain a lot of parts of your lineage, you might need to try a different avenue. Because I can speak for the DAR sake that's going to be no more than one analysis per lineage. But you cannot use an analysis to defend a published source. The published source needs to stand on its own. And analysis must focus on that core argument and not provide a lot of evidence that otherwise is not proven through the evidence that you provided. So you can't assume that someone is the son of someone else if you haven't provided a document stating that relationship. So kind of watch phrasing in terms of your analysis. I kind of put this together as well, just kind of a helpful thing. This is assuming that your ancestor is brand new and you need to establish this evidence up front when you're joining. But for establishing the facts of a person, this is a key to establishing the life events. For instance, for this person, this is all made up by the way, but I have a deed establishing his age. The next several documents prove his residency using tax list, which helps establish that we're assigning him service in Amelia County. And then the last document there is the proof of his death. All of this is basically to provide proof of all of his events, but at the same time, too, providing a source. You don't want to provide an image to the reviewer where they're like, okay, what is this, or why did you include this? You want to be a little bit more transparent, and that's why little guides like this can be very helpful to help in this. But make sure, by the way, that you don't provide like a 20 or 30-page report, because the reviewers are always going to look down on that. You do want to help get to the next paper. So if you're bogging them down by providing them a very professional report that took years to put together, they're not going to look at all that. So you want to get down to the basis of everything to get to your ancestor. Conflicting evidence is, again, you have those situations. You might have multiple men of that name in that area, or multiple women. Always look to make sure are there other people there? And are we sure this service that you found belongs to your ancestor? So use that, that reasoning, going out, finding out whether, the person that you're finding the service for is eligible for it through other factors. Is anyone else also claiming this service? If you do find state line or continental service, always investigate bounty land records and pensions for that evidence. And if you do a search, if your ancestor's name is John Richards and you find multiple men from Virginia with that name, go through all of those pensions and search and make sure that they're not claiming something that you think might belong to your ancestor. All right. You want to always check that conflicting evidence ahead of time. And then when you get back down to it, once you are sure and you're ready to go to the next step, proclaim your interest by reaching out to a chapter. Almost all of them are going to have either their own websites, or they're going to have their contact information through the web pages of each of these societies, the DAR, the CAR, what have you. They'll have where you reach out to them. The chapters are going to assist you automatically in putting together their application. And they're going to ensure that you have all the documentation ready and everything put together on the process, that you've paid your dues. And they're also going to help you, with acceptability as well. Because again, you do have to have two members that will approve you. So But and also I could speak again on the DAR's behalf, but DAR can also assist you in tracing your lineage for your fastest avenue of membership. Anything when it comes to a lineage society, as a new member, they're going to take you towards that path of an established lineage first, if it exists, before you choose that new ancestor that you found elsewhere in your lineage. Because they don't want all the hassle of getting all that extra work done if they can cut out half of that work by getting to an established lineage. So they're always going to go that path first. Um, DAR and SAR have searchable databases, by the way. You can do that work ahead of time if you want to. They have the annotated, or sorry, the transcribed lineages for any established member you could connect to see if you do connect to anybody that is already established. So that is my presentation. I sorry we went on a little bit longer than I thought, but that is everything I have here today. And Paul, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, I've got some questions in the chat box. Let's see, any organizations for Hessian soldier descendants?
I am not aware of any right now. Not that I'm aware of, but of course, there's so many. I would almost say even just like very small purpose, very bizarre, very distinct lineage societies out there. And even ones that are popping up more recently these days. So if there isn't one already, you never know. Someone could probably go ahead and found one right now. So
Okay. Got a question. What is the reference to M804? David, I did respond with a link to the PDF from the National Archives, but Brandon, if you wanted to talk about that a little more.
NARA M804
Thank you.
is the National Archives collection for the Revolutionary War pensions, but that's the federal pensions, not any of the specific state pensions. You can access that directly through Fold 3. You could find that also on ancestry.com and also on Family Search. Family Search is Ancestry, you have to have a subscription, but Family Search, it is free. You just have to establish an account with them, and otherwise, you are able to search their resources.
And the PDF I linked is just information about the series, I believe. Okay, what was that RevWar website for Southern states? Again, I put in a link in the chat box. Hopefully the person who asked saw that.
I am going to, by the way, I'll provide. I think someone asked about a handout as well. I'm going to put together a very annotated, a compressed version of all this, but anything that has a link or something specific, I'll provide that in the handout version so people have that. But yeah. And some of those websites I also mentioned as well, like Debbie DeWay's website, the learnwebskills.com. A lot of that is very much geared towards DAR members and also SAR. So a lot of that also, on a very elementary level to start. A lot of those links are already there as well if you need to.
Okay. What can you do if the pension record was part of the ones burned in the fire 1800 in Washington?
Hopefully they have something else that might try to capture it thereafter. But most of what's going to be affected are the invalid pensioners and also the first wave of people that applied for bounty land. For the most part, if you're able to get any certificates from them following the path thereafter, try to follow that path. But outside of that, if it's burned, it's burned, and there's very little that recourse that you can do on that. I don't remember certain counties, actually most counties of Virginia, they did keep copies in their court orders for people that did come forth to apply for a declaration for pension benefits. You're not going to get the declaration if it's pre-1818, but you'll probably get notice that someone appeared before and applied for pension benefits. I would check with the county court orders in that case. You may not get a lot of description though. But after 1818, though, most counties did keep copies of the declarations and insert it in their court orders as well. And I did find instances where there are some people that did apply through there whose paperwork does not appear in M804 at all. So sometimes you might get those cues as well. And I would always check that avenue too.
If my ancestor received a land grant during the correct time period in North Carolina, is it understood for DAR purposes that that ancestor took the oath of allegiance?
As long as it's within as long as it's after the act that required an oath of allegiance, yes. For North Carolina's sake, it's the entries. It's not the land warrants, it's the entries, because it was the entry step of the process where you were required to take the oath of allegiance. The issuance of the warrant was at a later date, and a lot of times we had a lot of people that either filed their caveats because it conflicted with an existing grant, or that it may have been transferred along the process to someone else, and whoever received that land later on may not have been required to take the oath. So it's whoever took the entry in North Carolina. But if it's after the act, which it's in early 1778, then yes, it is implied that they took an oath.
Okay. And some of these are just comments. There was Billy Flora, a free African American who fought against the British at the Battle of Great Bridge, which is located in Chesapeake, Virginia. There are
Mm-hmm.
several African American members of my DAR Chesapeake chapter. We just celebrated our 40th anniversary.
Congrats.
I just joined the DAR through my father's maternal ancestor, my fourth great-grandfather, Charles Matthew Smith, from Gates County, North Carolina. Yes, there was documentation for someone with the surname of Smith. I just had to tie into an application that a descendant of my great-grandfather's sister had submitted. I don't think
Yeah,
the
I mean,
problem is finding Smith records. It's discerning which Smith records are your
yeah,
Smith records. I
I
speak as a
have to get
Williams. I get that.
exactly. I have to give the hell to the common names because it's people always think they find one name of it in their area and that's it, but it's like there could be four or five of them popping around in that same area, so that's why. But yeah, definitely.
Where would I look for Navy service in Virginia?
If it exists, that's the thing. More often than not, you're going to find proof of the ship and their commanding officers, but you may not find a lot of proof otherwise of anybody thereon. I could say with personal experience trying to do this, it can be hell. Again, it's going to be pretty much contingent on trying to search the audited accounts if you can. Again, a lot of those right now are not indexed. Start with those that are. Um, some of those as well that we do have on the DAR, the Patriot Records Index as well. You might search through there, but it's going to be contingent on finding the audited accounts in that case. There's very few other cases otherwise where you're really going to find anybody or any surviving list of Marines or sailors from a particular ship.
Does the time of being captured and imprisoned by the British count for time served?
It does not. It does not, even though that still is proof of patriotic service, but it does not count towards military service, no.
Okay.
Because during that time, they would have been reported as either prisoner or if their status was unknown for a while, they would have been AWOL or even at sometimes also declared deserted. But that's not proof of service, no.
Okay. Where can we find those militia class lists you mentioned, for example, from Montgomery and Botetourt counties?
So, Montgomery County, Montgomery County's Mary Kegley, who's a genealogist from Wytheville, Virginia, she's done a lot of stuff when it comes to that area down there, Wythe County in particular. She did a book many years ago that compiles all that, and I think it was published through her book, her publication company, Kegley Books. I don't think that is existent anymore in terms of publication. But there's another book called Crushes, The First 100 Years of Montgomery County that also has some of those lists. I will say ahead of time, also Elizabeth Bentley's Virginia Military Records will also have some. I have Montgomery County ancestry as well. A lot of those lists are not necessarily dated. So if they are an undated list, you will want to look to see if you can find as much as possible when that list came from. And we've done some reconstructions of our own and trying to figure out when the captain was appointed, when they were discharged, or when they resigned. But some of those lists you really got to watch out for. Um, Culpeper County, there's a book by Blankenbeckler. I cannot remember the author's first name. I'm trying to do this off the top of my head, but it's Blankenbeckler. It's the class list of Culpeper County. It's a book that basically just it has everything broken down. It's a very small book too. If you want to look through the library catalog of the DAR website, you can find it on there because I know we have a copy of it. But it's the class list of the Culpeper militia. The one for Botetourt, I cannot recall off the top of my head. I can provide that in my handout though for anybody that's interested.
Okay. That would be great. Thank you. Lots and lots of comments. Thanks for a fantastic presentation. Are most all of the websites free of charge or membership subscription required? I know you mentioned Ancestry several times requiring a subscription, and Fold 3 as well, but the others
Yes.
that you mentioned.
Most all the other ones I have mentioned are all free. Like I said, I mentioned Family Search. That's the one for the LDS Church. That one does require that you set up an account, but it is free. And there's various stages of access once you're in because they have been digitizing a lot of things on all their microfilm that you can't order anymore. But certain things have restrictions depending on whoever owns that. So there's things you can view from home, and there's things you might need to go to a local FHL library or FHL designated center to look at. But that would be the only one I could say that requires any kind of free subscription. Anything else outside of that, you should be able to access from anywhere you're located.
If you're using a family Bible as proof of lineage, what do I need to copy of the Bible to include with the application?
As much as possible, and this is if it's possible, but the front page of it that gives the publication information, the pages of the entries, as well as any identifying information, if it's possible, about the ownership of it over time. Especially based off of when the Bible was published, because there's going to be some concern if it's a Bible that was published in 1900 that's giving dates to someone that was born in 1720 versus a 1790 Bible containing similar dates, because it's close. The author of that information is most likely going to be closer towards that time period rather than probably having recollected it or written it down through various transcriptions. Um, Transcriptions otherwise we do accept in certain cases, especially if it's through respected periodicals or collections, as long as it's again providing that similar information about when the Bible was published, who owns it, or who owned it at one point. That kind of information we're looking for, just to kind of identify the provenance of that information, and the accuracy of it.
Are most records for West Virginia still under Virginia?
Yes, but it depends on what you're searching for. But if you're looking through like family search, you're going to want to look. It's going to automatically link you to West Virginia automatically. But it's going to depend on what, because like the tax list, for instance, the personal property taxes, even though they are now in West Virginia, those were still under Virginia's jurisdiction, and those, for instance, are going to be held by the Library of Virginia. But even though you might find those on Family Search, and they're going to be under West Virginia. But most things, if you're going to look them up on certain websites, they're going to be filed under West Virginia.
Are there any books focusing on Hampshire County, later Hardy County?
Not that I am familiar with specifically, because for the most part, they are going to. There are a couple of regiments of one regiment that was um, enlisted there. I can't remember which one it is, but Sanchez Saavedra's book covers which one that was. But otherwise, you're going to find mostly people from there are going to be providing patriotic service through furnishing supplies or paying a supply tax. Or if there's any, well, I would say civil service, but there's not many surviving court records from that county during that period. So, but there's not, as far as I know, any book that's specific towards that area. So no.
Okay. Thank you. Even though I have numerous colonial ancestors, the process to prove a patriot seems overwhelming and nearly impossible. It's so hard to show relationships before the early 1800s unless your ancestors were wealthy.
Yeah, I can very much sympathize with that. It's definitely, once you can find out, if you are able to, as much as possible. That's why we prioritize proving residence. If you know where they are at, and if you really need a cheat guide, as I mentioned, that Debbie Dway website, she has that index to the personal property taxes for 1783. That's a good cheat right there to kind of find, if you know your ancestor's name. Um, Go on there and see how many results there might be. Again, yeah, John Smiths are on there too. You might have a whole lot of them, but figure out what counties they're under. And, hopefully you find someone in there, doesn't have many entries in different counties, but that's a good cheat guide to try and find at least where somebody was in 1783. And if you do, then take it from there and kind of search those kind of resources. So there's definitely almost always a way through.
Okay. And lots more fantastic presentations. I'm also working on an application to join the National Society of the Daughters of the American Colonists using my Jamestown line. I can also join the Jamestown Society using the same line. Looking forward to watching this on GRIVA's YouTube channel. Marilyn Jackson posted the name of the Culpeper class list. John Blackenbecker
Yes, that's it.
is the name you were looking for.
Yes. Thank you.
Getting some questions. How are we going to get the handout? When we get it from Brendon, we will put it on the GRIVA website. We will mention it in the next email that comes out from GRIVA, and we'll also put a link to it on the recording on YouTube. So in the description on YouTube, we'll have a link to the handout, at least for a while. The Draper manuscripts are at the Wisconsin History Society. I've seen my ancestor's muster rolls. He served with George Rogers Clark.
Yeah, the Wisconsin one is the most definitive one, but there's other variation. There's other parts of the Draper collection as well that go to other states as well. So they're held by multiple state historical societies, but the Wisconsin one is the biggest one. It's the most well known.
Yes. To clarify regarding North Carolina land grants and oaths of allegiance, the DAR considers it proof that an ancestor took an oath of allegiance if there's documentation that the ancestor made the land entry, which is what you said. If the land grant was made over to an ancestor when a different man made the land entries for that land, even if it was made over during the war, the DAR does not consider that sufficient proof that the ancestor took the oath of allegiance. The ancestor must have made the land entry. So that backs up what you were saying.
Yes. And also, again, in North Carolina is the same way as well, because you're going to find it too. There are entries that were made in women's names, and the legislation in North Carolina is specific as well in saying that women did not take the oath. So again, if an entry is made in a woman's name, she didn't take the oath and it's not service. So watch out for that too.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This is so wonderful. People are so excited, and we will have the video available soon. It takes a little while to process, but it'll be available certainly by tomorrow morning.
All right. Thank you very much for having me.